All right, now for our second video to do with biological macromolecules, properties, structures, and functions, we're going to look at lipids, right? And are kind of the weird ones in the bunch when we look at the five classes of macromolecules, all right? But they might also be really familiar to us. So lipids are basically long hydrocarbon chains. And what that word hydrocarbon means, if you can kind of break it down, hydro and carbon, are long chains of hydrogens and carbons bonded to each other, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and a few oxygens. If you look down here, carbon, 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 all with hydrogens attached to it. It's very typical of a hydrocarbon. All right. When you're looking at the structure, here's a structure of, this is actually a triglyceride, which is a lipid, right? When you're looking at the structures, some people may ask, hey, we just looked that last time that carbohydrates are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So how do you tell the difference between a lipid and a carbohydrate structurally? And this is my clue to you. In carbohydrates, if you look at a picture like this, or the formula like this, carbohydrates will have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in a ratio that's approximately, for every one carbon, two hydrogens, one oxygen. So 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, like C6H12O6, that's glucose, 1 to 2 to 1. It won't always be exact, but it will be extremely close to 1 to 2 to 1. Lipids do not have that ratio at all. There isn't a ratio. What you will see is that there are overwhelmingly more carbon and hydrogen and only a few oxygens in lipids. We can break the groups of lipids down into three. There are fats or triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. And so when we look at the functions and the properties next, we'll talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. Important though, lipids are not polymers. All right? This is a triglyceride, for example. You can see that it's made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 components. 1, 2, 3 yellow things and a purple thing. But then that's it. This is one triglyceride. You can't make a diglyceride or a polyglyceride by linking a bunch of these together. No, that doesn't work. So lipids are not polymers. All right? They're not a continuing chain, okay? Really, the only thing that lipids have in common, besides being long hydrocarbon chains, is that they are all nonpolar. All right? They are all hydrophobic. They don't mix in water. And you can test that very easily by trying to mix some vegetable oil in water. All right? It might happen momentarily, but then they will spontaneously separate. They don't mix in water. So fats is the first group of lipids. Another name for a fat is a triglyceride. Triglyceride is fats. All right. the structure of a triglyceride, or of a fat, is it has one glycerol molecule, which is a 3-carbon alcohol. That's what this thing in blue is, 3-carbon alcohol. And then it has fatty acids, 3 of them attached to it. In a triglyceride, 3 of them. And this yellow thing is a fatty acid. It's basically just a long chain of carbons and hydrogens with this place here, this end here, that allows for a dehydration synthesis reaction to occur so they can be linked together. So if I would add 2 more of these fatty acids, one right here and one right here, they would each attach to the glycerol, and we'd have a triglyceride. So 3 dehydration synthesis reactions would occur and make our fat, make our triglyceride. The overwhelmingly most important function of a fat, of a triglyceride in specific, is to store energy for the long term. All right? Fats have a lot of energy in them. There's a lot of, like we talked about, carbohydrates, there's a lot of carbon-carbon bonds. That's where the energy is. Remember I said to think energy. There's a lot of them, so they store a lot of energy. But they are hard to break down. It takes a long time. So fats are used to store energy that we are going to keep with us for a long time, are used very slowly. They aren't as easy to break down, so we can't retrieve the energy from them as quickly as carbohydrates. So they are all nonpolar and hydrophobic. Other roles that they have is to cushion and insulate the body. Think about like blubber on whales that live in really cold environments. Right? They are a good insulator of heat. In fact, another main thing that fat's used for is in the myelin sheaths in your neurons. Because not only are they good heat insulators, but they are also good electrical insulators. There are 2 types of fats, saturated and unsaturated. You probably have heard of them before and seen them on food labels. But there is a specific biochemical difference. A saturated fat has all of their carbons bonded to hydrogens. There's no double bonds in between 2 carbons in the fatty acid part of a saturated fat. So look down here. This is stearic acid. It's a saturated fatty acid. All of the carbons are joined by single bonds. There are no double bonds. Because there's no double bonds, it is a long straight chain. And long straight chains can pack together really well. That's why most saturated fats are solid at room temperature, like butter or animal fat. Because they can pack together really easily, that's why eating diets high in saturated fat contributes to cardiovascular disease. Because if you eat a lot of that saturated fat, it can start to collect and become packed together in your arteries and lead to atherosclerosis. So saturated fats, no double bonds. Unsaturated fats do have at least one double bond in their fatty acids. So look at this one down here. This is alpha-linoleic acid. Look at here is a carbon-to-carbon double bond in its fatty acid chain. We found one. As long as it has one, it is an unsaturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fat. Some of them might have more than one and be called polyunsaturated, but you need at least one. Because they have at least one double bond, this tail, this fatty acid starts to kink or curve. And that prevents it from packing as tightly as saturated fats. Therefore, these fats are liquid at room temperature. So think like oils. And they also do not, because they are, sorry, let me start again. Because it is a lot harder for them to be packed together, they do not contribute to cardiovascular disease as much. Saturated fatty acids and unsaturated. The double bond is the difference. The second class of lipids I want to talk about is called phospholipids. They're called phospholipids because they have a phosphate group with phosphorus that's attached to one of the carbons. See, this is glycerol again, attached to one of the carbons of glycerol instead of a third fatty acid. So a triglyceride had glycerol and 3 fatty acids. A phospholipid has glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and a phosphate group. Now the cool thing about that phosphate group is the phosphate part, this part I circled, is polar. It's hydrophilic. It will mix with water, while the bottom part, this part, will not. So it has both a polar part and a nonpolar part. That is really important for its function, like we'll talk about next. Because the hydrophilic, and I'm going to call it head, the head part is where the phosphate group is. And it has a hydrophobic tail. If we put a bunch of phospholipids in water, they could self-assemble into a bubble, or a misicle we call them, like this. The hydrophilic head part that likes water is facing out, facing the water, ready to mix with it. The hydrophobic nonpolar tail parts are all crunched in the inside trying to avoid water. And this was the first example of compartmentalization, and it led to the plasma membrane in all of our cells. So phospholipid's main function is the key component of our plasma or phospholipid membrane. Just like this, like the picture on the right. And then the last class of lipids are called steroids. And the general structure of a steroid is there'll be 4 fused carbon rings, at least. Other things might be attached to it, but you will at least see 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. This part right here will be the same. So here's a picture of cholesterol. It's a lipid. And the other things, what's attached to it, like in these boxes, will change depending on what type of steroid it is. And steroids have a whole slew of different jobs. They could be hormones, they could be signaling molecules, all right? They could be components of your plasma membrane like cholesterol. They're very, very diverse, but the main similarity is they have these 4 fused ring structures with some different functional groups attached. And just like all lipids, they're nonpolar. Cholesterol is by far the most important steroid because it's used as a precursor for all the other steroids, including estrogen, testosterone. It's really important to add flexibility and fluidity to the plasma membrane. But on the other hand, if there are high levels of it found in your blood, it can contribute to cardiovascular disease. It can get stuck and clogged in those blood vessels and cause a heart attack or a stroke or ischemia or things like that. All right. And here on the last page, I just kind of want to show you some different It's been a long day. I want to show you some different steroids that are all made from cholesterol. And look at how they're all similar. So, for example, steroid hormones made in the adrenal glands. Here's cortisol and aldosterone. Look how similar they are. Look at this structure that they have in common and also have in common with cholesterol. And then in the darker red circle, there's the difference. Vastly different functions just because of that circle part up there. Here are some hormones primarily made in the sex organs. Here's testosterone, estrogen. Look at testosterone and estrogen are almost virtually the same. Look at the small difference. Extra H, missing the H. We've got some added double bonds here instead of a double bond there. And then progesterone. We've got this added group right there. So they all have similar templates, like I was saying, those four fused ring, just small different things that are attached. But that's all that there is today for lipids. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, that should be it.